The town of Lakeview, Oregon was known for its tranquility, and the locals knew each other not only by name, but also by destinies, family ties, and habits. In this quiet corner lived James and Sarah Anderson, an ordinary-looking young couple. James was a successful architect, and Sarah taught English at the local school. They had been together for over 5 years, and their marriage looked exemplary, at least at first glance. Every morning began with the usual rituals. James would get ready for work, Sarah would be in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Outside the windows of their house, flowers and shrubs sprouted, and the garden was always well tended. It was Sarah's pride. She loved spending time among the greenery, although lately the garden was more a reminder of something lost than of joy. Life went on as usual, but something invisibly changed in their relationship. The central figure in this closed family universe was Elizabeth Anderson, Sarah's mother. Her frequent visits were seen as the norm, for after her divorce she sought intimacy with her daughter, whom she never left without her attention. Elizabeth owned a small flower store in the center of town, where she grew rare plants. This made the store popular with flora lovers, but flowers were more than just a business for Elizabeth. They were her refuge, a way to hide her inner turmoil from the outside world. Elizabeth was a woman of strong character. She was always surrounded by respect and interest, but many people knew that underneath her refined appearance, there was something more. Her attractiveness persisted even into her mature years, and it attracted men on more than one occasion, but for Elizabeth there was always only one important man in her life, her son-in-law James. Over time, more than simple sympathy developed between them. This secret romance had been going on for months. Though their encounters were infrequent and imbued with a sense of danger, their bond was so strong that both couldn't stop. But James was beginning to feel a growing sense of guilt. Every time he looked into his wife's eyes, he was overcome with the realization that he was betraying her and her trust. Sarah suspected nothing, but her natural sensitivity told her that something was wrong lately. She could sense the elusive tension in James, his elusive, distant looks, but she didn't yet know what it was. Elizabeth, unlike James, felt no guilt. She saw the affair as her right to the happiness she couldn't find with another man. She saw James not only as her lover, but as a man who could replace all that she had lost in her life. She longed for James to choose her, and that desire became her only goal. But things were changing. James was realizing that their relationship was going too far. He could no longer lie to himself or his wife. He finally decided that he had to end this relationship, no matter how much it hurt. He needed to put his focus back on his family and try to mend the rift that was beginning to undermine his marriage to Sarah. "I can't go on like this," James said to himself one evening when Elizabeth invited him in for a cup of tea after the store closed. He looked at her, realizing that this would be their last time. Elizabeth sensed the change in his mood, but didn't yet realize what was happening. She expected it to be like it always was, a brief conversation, smiles, and then the passion they both craved. But instead, James stood up from the table, adjusted his jacket, and said, "We need to finish. I can't go on with this any longer." Elizabeth froze. For her, the words sounded like a cold stab. She'd always thought she was in control, that she had James under her control. But here he stood, sure of his decision, and that decision left no room for compromise. "James," she said with a note of confusion in her voice, "you can't just walk away. You and we have something that can't just be cut off." He shook his head. "I have to. I love my wife. It's not right." Elizabeth tried to stifle the coming wave of panic. Her fingers began to tremble, but she tried to keep her face straight. She couldn't let him leave. He was her only joy, the only meaning of her life. Without him, everything would lose meaning. "Please think again," she said softly, almost pleadingly. But James was already adamant. "It's over, Elizabeth," he said, and without waiting for her response, he left the store. She was left alone. For the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt like she was losing control. Everything she had spent so long building was crumbling before her eyes, but even at this moment, she couldn't admit defeat. A plan was already brewing in her head, a plan that would bring James back to her or destroy him if he didn't give in. That evening, James returned home to Sarah's house, trying to appear calm. But his inner world was in chaos. He loved his wife, but memories of passionate nights with Elizabeth haunted him. He thought breaking up with his mother-in-law would be the end of this nightmarish situation, but instead it made it even harder. Sarah greeted him with a smile, offering him dinner. Her eyes, full of love and trust, only made him feel more guilty. James knew he couldn't lie anymore. He needed to move on for Sarah's sake, for their future. Several days passed after that evening when James severed all ties with Elizabeth. Outwardly, his life was slowly returning to a normal flow. He focused on work, tried to be an attentive and caring husband to Sarah, but a storm raged inside him. Guilt and fear of exposure haunted him every minute. With every smile Sarah smiled, with every innocent look she gave him, his inner tension grew. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to come to the Anderson home. Her visits were regular, and Sarah always enjoyed seeing her mother. She saw Elizabeth as her closest stronghold. But James now greeted her visits with a sense of impending danger. He tried to avoid communicating with his mother-in-law, to isolate himself from her, but this made the tension even more obvious. Elizabeth never forgot what had happened. Her mind was filled with dark thoughts. She tried to understand how it could have come to this. James had become more than just a son-in-law to her. He was her last chance at happiness. And now he was giving her up for her daughter? The humiliation and pain was eating her from the inside out. But if he can't be hers willingly, then she's willing to do anything to make sure no one else can have him, not even Sarah. One of the symbols through which Elizabeth expressed her passion and obsession was her flower store. She often spent long hours there, surrounded by her rare plants, caring for them with the same reverence she would have wanted to care for James. One of her favorite plants was a rare, exotic bloom, a brownish-yellow flower that she had struggled to obtain from faraway lands. This plant became her symbol, the one piece of jewelry in her life that no one else had. She couldn't afford to lose James, and her desire to act was growing into something dark, sinister. Months of secret passion couldn't just end. The sudden breakup had shattered all her hopes and plans, but along with it, a new resolve grew in her. She would not sit back and watch Sarah continue to live with James. Sarah noticed that James had become strange and distant. His presence was there, but his thoughts were clearly hovering somewhere far away. She had tried to talk to him several times, but each time he had given her generalizations about being busy at work and being tired. Sarah didn't realize that behind those words lay something much darker. Like any loving wife, she hoped it was only a temporary crisis. She saw her husband as the man she was ready to spend the rest of her life with, and she didn't think anyone else could come between them. One night, when Elizabeth arrived for dinner, the situation escalated to a fever pitch. James could hardly control his behavior as he sat across from his mother-in-law at the communal table. He tried not to look her in the eye so as not to give himself away, but his inner tension was palpable in his every gesture. Elizabeth, on the other hand, remained calm, but her gaze directed at James spoke more than words. Sarah, on the other hand, was completely absorbed in her conversation with her mother, unaware of the hidden dynamic between her husband and Elizabeth. "How's the work at the store going, Mother?" Sarah asked, pouring wine into her mother's glass. "Same as always, dear," Elizabeth replied calmly, glancing at James's face. "We have new customers. By the way, James, you've been interested in rare plants, haven't you? I recently received a very interesting shipment." James flinched faintly at her words, but quickly pulled himself together. "Yes, of course it's curious," he replied dryly. Elizabeth did not pursue the subject, but her voice seemed to sound too soft, too restrained. Sarah, not noticing the tension in the room, continued the conversation, unaware that at this dinner the three people present were playing a much more complicated game than she had realized. Over the next few days, James began planning a family vacation with Sarah. He decided that he needed a distraction, to spend more time with the two of them and thus try to restore intimacy to their relationship. He hoped that a little trip out of town would help to strengthen their bond, to bring back into the marriage what had been lost. He cherished the idea, thinking that things could still be fixed. But Sarah had unexpectedly insisted on inviting her mother along for the weekend. She didn't see anything wrong with it, after all. They had always been close. James could hardly contain his disappointment. The trip that was supposed to be the salvation of their marriage now risked turning into another torture for him. He was trapped in a trap he had created for himself. Elizabeth, of course, agreed. She had always maintained a close relationship with her daughter, and Sarah couldn't imagine that her mother could refuse such a simple offer. For Elizabeth, however, this was more than just a trip. It was an opportunity to be near James again, to observe him, influence him, and perhaps even bring him back. The day of the trip had arrived. Sarah and James were getting ready to leave, and as always, Elizabeth showed up on time. She was dressed simply but tastefully. Her hair was neatly styled, and she held a small basket of food in her hands. She was smiling as if nothing was happening, as if there was no tension between her and James. On the road, James hardly spoke at all. He listened to Sarah and Elizabeth as they cheerfully discussed various topics, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. He thought over and over again about his actions and tried to figure out what to do now. He felt that something had to happen sooner or later, that their lives could not continue in such a tense equilibrium. On their arrival, they settled down in a small cottage on the shore of the lake. In the evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen, Elizabeth and James found themselves alone in the living room. It was inevitable, and James understood that. "I can see that you still can't get over me," Elizabeth said softly, looking into his eyes. James turned sharply toward her, trying to keep his emotions in check. "We've already talked about this, Elizabeth. Please, let's put it behind us." Elizabeth took a step forward, her voice low and strained. "You can't just leave me like this. I gave you everything, James. I loved you when no one else could understand you. And now you want to leave me for her?" James felt his nerves on edge. But at that moment, Sarah came out of the kitchen, and the scene changed instantly. Elizabeth had put back on her mask of the serene woman, the caring mother who was simply enjoying an evening with her family. But James realized that this wasn't the end. Elizabeth wouldn't back down, and he was right. That evening, when Sarah went to bed first, James stayed outside, gazing at the calm surface of the lake. He felt like he couldn't live in this nightmare any longer. But the thought flashed through his mind that perhaps he was already too deeply entrenched to find a way out. Several days had passed since James and Elizabeth had last spoken. James had been trying to get his life together by distracting himself with work and spending more time with Sarah. He wanted to forget that anything had ever happened between him and Elizabeth. Everything he did was aimed at getting back to normal family life. But with each passing day, a growing sense of unease wouldn't let him go. He knew it wouldn't end that easily. Elizabeth no longer tried to speak openly with James. Her silence pressed on him, causing him to fear. She was a shadow present on the periphery of his life, relentlessly reminding him of himself with her invisible presence. He was haunted by the thought that she was up to something terrible, but he didn't know how to proceed. Every night he looked at Sarah, who suspected nothing, and gave up the idea of telling her the truth. Elizabeth's love for James, obsession with him, and fear of losing him had become a destructive force. Her decision finally matured, and she began to prepare. The evening before the tragedy, Elizabeth came to visit the Andersons. As she often did, Sarah was happy to see her, unaware of what her mother was hiding behind her smile. In the kitchen, they cooked dinner, laughing and talking. James stayed upstairs in the study, trying not to face Elizabeth. His anxiety was growing by the hour, and he felt that this night would bring something irreversible. As dinner was being prepared, Elizabeth was paying close attention to all the details. She knew where the kitchen knives were. She knew Sarah and James's routines. It would all become part of her plan. Sarah suspected nothing as she continued to enthusiastically tell her mother about the plans for the weekend. When dinner was ready, the three of them sat down to dinner. The evening seemed normal, but there was a tension in the air that only James could feel. He hardly ate, depressed by his own thoughts. But behind that calmness was a clear certainty that everything would soon change. After dinner, Sarah was tired and decided to go to bed early. Elizabeth, left alone with James, gave him a long look, as if expecting him to say something. But James remained silent, his heart pounding in his chest. She picked up one of the kitchen knives, felt its cold steel, and a final plan began to form in her mind. The next morning, the Anderson house woke up to silence Sarah. First thing she did was head to the kitchen to make coffee. But when she entered James's bedroom, her heart sank. Her body lay motionless on the bed, her face contorted with horror. A bloody kitchen knife glistened on the floor. Sarah screamed, her scream echoing throughout the house. Barely regaining consciousness, Sarah grabbed the phone and called the police. Panic gripped her mind, but she tried to keep her cool. James was dead, and she didn't understand how that could have happened. Her mind was spinning with incoherent thoughts as she tried to remember the last night, every detail that could explain what had happened. When the police arrived, the house was cordoned off. Sarah sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself in a state of shock, unable to utter a word. Detectives Burns and Chen were the first to arrive on the scene and immediately got on the case. The forensics team looked around the house collecting evidence while the detectives began asking Sarah questions. Burns, a middle-aged man with a discerning eye, immediately paid attention to details. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was lying right on the floor next to the body. Next to it was a note James had supposedly written before he died. In it, he apologized to Sarah and said he was leaving her. The note looked strange, too terse and unemotional, but the handwriting was similar to James's. It confused the detectives, but at first glance everything pointed to suicide or a violent argument that ended in tragedy. They started by interviewing Sarah. "Tell me, Mrs. Anderson," Burns began, "have you and your husband had any quarrels lately?" Sarah shook her head. She couldn't believe that anyone could even think that she was capable of something like that. No, she squeezed out, stammering. "We were fine. He didn't say anything to me about leaving. How was last night? Was there anything strange?" Burns continued, trying not to push her too hard. Sarah shook her head again, remembering having dinner with her mother and James. Everything had been within normal limits. "No, we had dinner. Then I went to bed." Sarah's voice was shaking. Chen, the second detective, who was scrutinizing her every word, stepped closer. "Was anyone else in the house? Could someone have come in?" "My mom was here. We were making dinner together and then she left," Sarah replied. Burns and Chen exchanged glances. Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, was clearly an important part of the story. They decided it was worth questioning her, but for now they concentrated on looking around the house. They scrutinized the kitchen, where the knife had probably been taken from. Everything seemed to be in place, but one little thing caught Chen's attention. On the handle of the knife, in addition to traces of blood, there were small particles of something that could not be immediately identified. "What is this dust?" he asked, pointing to the knife. Burns frowned and turned to the forensics team. "Take it for analysis. It could be important." At this point in the investigation, the focus was on Sarah. Everything pointed to her, her belongings, the knife from the kitchen, the note from James. As Sarah was taken away for further questioning, Elizabeth stood back, watching with outward calm. She knew she had done everything she could to deflect suspicion away from herself, and she was confident that she was blameless. Sarah, her own daughter, was trapped, and now everything depended on how long the illusion could be maintained. While Sarah was in a fog of horror and despair, her interrogation at the police station went on as usual. Detectives Burns and Chen scrutinized all the details. They did not rush to conclusions, although everything pointed to her. It was too simple, and simplicity in these cases rarely brings the truth. There was an oppressive silence in the interrogation room. Sarah sat at the table, her hands trembling, her eyes inflamed with tears. Across from her sat Burns, stroking his chin and making occasional notes. He tried to remain friendly, but tension hung in the air. "So, Mrs. Anderson," Burns began, his voice soft, "we want to help you, but to do that, we need to understand what happened last night." Sarah nodded nervously, not knowing what to say. Her thoughts were jumbled. She couldn't believe she was in the middle of this nightmare. "Yeah, don't know," she finally squeezed out. "Everything was fine. I had dinner with my mom. Then I went to bed." Her voice trembled. She lost control of her emotions. "I didn't know anything. How could this have happened?" Burns leaned forward, his voice becoming more serious. You said your mother was at your house. Are you sure she left before you went to bed? Sarah looked up, surprised by the question. Yes. Her voice grew quieter. At least I think so. She said goodbye to me. Said she was tired. The detectives knew that in such cases anyone could be suspicious, but so far all the evidence pointed to Sarah. They decided to question Elizabeth to get her side of the story. Sarah remained in a state of shock, unable to understand how she could be suspected of murdering her own husband. Elizabeth was called in for questioning a few hours later. She showed up at the station looking calm and collected. Unlike Sarah, her face did not express excitement or panic. This alarmed the detectives, but they were in no hurry to jump to conclusions. Burns met her in the hallway, pretending that the conversation would be rather formal. "Thank you for agreeing to come, Mrs. Lawrence," he began politely. "We want to ask you a few questions about last night." "Of course," Elizabeth replied with a slight smile. "I want to help. This is a terrible grief for our family." They went into the interview room. Elizabeth sat down opposite Burns, who opened a notebook and prepared to write down her statement. "Tell me, what time did you leave the Anderson house last night?" he asked, tilting his head to the side. "About 9 o'clock, if I am not mistaken," Elizabeth answered without hesitation. "We had dinner and I felt tired. I had to get up early for work, so I didn't linger." Burns nodded, taking notes. "Did you notice anything strange in James's or Sarah's behavior?" Elizabeth thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No. James seemed a little tense, but nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah was in a good mood, as always." Burns wasn't going to press Elizabeth, but her calmness alarmed him. He decided to change the subject to catch her off guard. "We found a note that James apparently wrote before he died. It said he was going to leave Sarah. Did you know anything about that?" Elizabeth froze for a moment, but quickly pulled herself together. "No, it was a shock to me," she said calmly. "I never thought James would do such a thing. They always seemed like such a happy couple. Did you ever notice any quarrels between them? Perhaps there was something hidden from view?" Burns watched her reaction carefully. Elizabeth only shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Sarah was madly in love with James, and I believe he was in love with her too." At that moment, Chen entered the room. He quietly walked over to Burns and whispered something important in his ear. He nodded and finished talking to Elizabeth, thanking her for her help. When she left, Chen shared the news. "The results of the pollen analysis on the knife came back," he said. "It's a rare plant, and its traces were on the murder weapon." "And where does it grow?" Burns asked, raising an eyebrow. Chen smiled. "Elizabeth Lawrence has it. She grows it in her flower store. It's the only place in town where you can find this plant." Burns thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Now the puzzle was starting to come together. The pollen couldn't just fall onto the knife, unless it had been left by someone who had access to it. "We're on the right track," he said quietly, realizing that the story was becoming more complicated than it first appeared. Meanwhile, Sarah remained in custody, her condition worsening by the hour. Her life had been turned upside down, and she didn't understand how she could be accused of killing her own husband. She was unaware of the details of the investigation and had no idea that the pollen found on the knife had already pointed the detectives in a different direction. In the detective's office, Burns and Chen discussed the next strategy. They decided to gather more evidence before calling Elizabeth back in for questioning. They knew that until they had hard evidence of her involvement, they couldn't charge her. But now they had reason to doubt her innocence. The important detail remained the note. Chen studied it again, paying attention to the handwriting. Though it was similar to James's, something about it was jarring. "Do you think it's possible that the note is forged?" Chen asked, scrutinizing the lines. Burns shrugged. "It could be. But if it is, someone did a good job of forging his handwriting. We need to analyze it, compare it to James's other notes." The note was sent for handwriting analysis. While the analysis was pending, the detectives continued to look for other clues. Meanwhile, they conducted another interview with Sarah, trying to get a handle on her relationship with her mother and whether there had ever been a feud between them. Sarah was surprised when she was asked questions about her mother. She didn't understand where the investigation was going, but she couldn't imagine that Elizabeth could be connected to James's murder. Their relationship had always been close, and Sarah trusted her mother more than anyone. In addition, Detectives Burns and Chen noticed a note that James allegedly wrote when he said goodbye to Sarah. The handwriting was skillfully forged, but graphology experts pointed out minor abnormalities that suggested the letter had been written by another person. This led detectives to re-examine James and Sarah's entourage, especially those who had access to the family's personal belongings. When they began asking neighbors and acquaintances, several of them mentioned seeing Elizabeth and James together in strange situations that indicated they were close. This, combined with the pollen evidence and Elizabeth's fake alibi, led detectives to the realization that Sarah's mother was not only involved in the murder, but also had a personal motive, a forbidden love for her son-in-law. The detectives kept digging, realizing that the denouement was close, but one last step had to be taken to catch Elizabeth in a lie. Elizabeth sat in the interrogation room with a nonchalant expression on her face. The eyes of Detectives Burns and Chen were fixed on her, but she didn't let her emotions get the best of her. She had a plan. She knew the detectives still had their doubts. After all, they had all along considered Sarah Elizabeth the prime suspect. Elizabeth had perfectly staged the whole thing so that her own daughter would be in jeopardy. The detectives exchanged a brief glance before Burns spoke. "Mrs. Lawrence, we have a few additional questions for you. We believe you may be able to help us." Elizabeth nodded, feigning interest, though inside her nerves were strained to the breaking point. "Of course," she said with fake concern in her voice. "Whatever it takes to find James's killer." Chen, whose face always seemed impassive, picked up his notes. "We need to clarify a few things. First, you were at Sarah's house on the day of the murder, weren't you?" "Yes," Elizabeth answered calmly, prepared for the question. "I went to her house in the afternoon to support her. We talked about James, as we always did. I left around 4 o'clock. Burns leaned forward slightly, his eyes watching her reaction. "And you didn't notice anything suspicious that day?" Elizabeth shook her head, hiding her nervousness behind a mask of calm. "No, nothing. James didn't look depressed the last time I saw him. The detectives looked like they were expecting something else." There was a long silence, and Elizabeth felt a shadow of doubt creep over her for a moment. But she was already too far gone to retreat. "We examined the note found next to James's body," Chen continued, keeping his eyes on her. "It was written in his name, but the forensics showed that the handwriting didn't match his usual handwriting." Elizabeth listened silently, trying not to make the slightest movement. "Are you sure it was his note?" she asked quietly, feigning surprise. "Sure," Burns answered. "It's a forgery. Someone close to him knew his handwriting well enough to try to imitate it." Elizabeth felt her hands sweat, but she didn't show it. They were beginning to get closer to the truth, but they still didn't suspect it directly. Panic was building inside her, but outwardly she remained cold. "I wonder," she said, "who would do such a thing?" "That's a good question," Burns nodded. "We think it's someone who wanted to make the murder look different than it really was." Chen added, "Another important point is the knife that James was killed with. We tested it and found traces of flower pollen on the handle. It corresponds to a plant that can only be found in your store." Elizabeth felt an icy wave of fear sweep over her. Everything inside her clenched. She had always been confident in her ability to cover her tracks, but this detail was unexpected. Still, she was prepared for this turn. "Flower pollen?" she asked with genuine bewilderment. "But I didn't bring any flowers with me when I visited Sarah." "That's curious," Chen replied, tilting his head to the side. "How did she end up at the murder weapon then?" "Maybe it was an accident when I was at Sarah's house," Elizabeth suggested, already feeling that her explanation was beginning to sound too unconvincing. "I do a lot of flower arranging, so maybe the pollen could have gotten on my hands." The detectives looked at each other but didn't pursue the matter further. "It's possible," Burns said, noting her tense state. "We'd like to question Sarah again. Do you think she might have noticed something?" "I don't know," Elizabeth answered, her voice more uncertain. After James died, she was completely broken. It's really hard for her right now. Chen wrote something down in his notebook and nodded briefly. "We'll invite her again." In the meantime, Mrs. Lawrence, stay in touch." Elizabeth stood up and headed for the door, inwardly trembling. As she walked out of the station, the cold wind stiffened her breath. She realized the noose was tightening, but she wasn't about to give up. When the detectives finally met with Sarah, she looked tired and depressed. She sat slumped over, as if the whole world was weighing on her shoulders. "I don't know what else I can tell you," she said tiredly. "I've already answered all your questions. Sarah, we understand this is hard for you," Chen said softly. "But we need to be clear about something. We can't release you until we find out who really killed your husband." "It wasn't me," Sarah said desperately, her eyes filling with tears. "I couldn't have hurt him." "Then tell us more about what happened that day," Burns asked. "You said your mom left around 4 o'clock. What happened after that?" Sarah thought, her gaze distracted. "I was left alone. James came home from work late, around 6. We hardly spoke. He looked tired. I went to bed earlier than usual. I was too tired." "And in the morning you found him dead?" Chen asked. "Yes," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw him in the kitchen. Blood. The knife." Burns, frowning, looked at Chen. There was something in this story that didn't fit together. "Sarah, on the handle of the knife they found pollen from flowers that only your mom has," Chen said cautiously. "Did you notice anything strange in her behavior that day?" Sarah froze, pondering his words. "Mom was tense," she admitted. "But I thought it was because James and I had fallen out. She'd always been very attached to him." "What exactly did he say to her?" Burns asked, feeling like he was getting closer to a clue. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember. "He said he needed space to sort himself and our relationship out." The detectives looked at each other. That could have been a motive. "Sarah," Chen said softly, "do you think your mother would do something like this to keep from losing James?" Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I don't know. I don't want to believe it. But she loved him so much." When the detectives called Elizabeth in again, their plan was simple. They wanted to see her reaction to her daughter's testimony. Elizabeth entered the office with the same nonchalant look, but her eyes betrayed an underlying anxiety. "We'd like to ask you a few questions again," Burns began. "Of course," she replied, though her voice was already shaking. "We know that James wanted to distance himself from you," Chen said. "And it came as a surprise to you." Elizabeth tensed, but tried to maintain control. "I didn't realize he was so determined," she replied. "We also know that the pollen on the murder weapon is a key piece of evidence," Burns continued, "and it points to you. Mrs. Lawrence, you weren't just at Sarah's house as a mother. You forged the note and killed James." Elizabeth turned pale. She realized that the detectives knew more than she had realized. Her carefully thought-out plan began to crumble right before her eyes. "Mrs. Lawrence," Burns continued, his voice firm but not aggressive, "we know about your secret affair with James. We also know that he was going to end his relationship with you to devote himself to his family." Elizabeth tried to gather her thoughts, but the words stuck in her throat. She realized it was pointless to deny. "You don't understand," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "I loved him. He promised me we would be together." Chen leaned forward. "You figured if you couldn't be with him, no one could, right? So you killed him and tried to frame Sarah." Tears came to Elizabeth's eyes. She couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. "I didn't mean to do that," she sobbed. "But he rejected me. After everything between us, I lost everything for him." Burns nodded softly. "We understand that you had strong feelings, but that doesn't justify killing him and trying to blame it on your own daughter." Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She realized there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Elizabeth was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The news spread quickly through the city, shocking everyone who knew the family. Sarah was released from custody, but her world was shattered. Learning that her own mother had killed her husband and tried to frame her herself was unbearable. Detectives Burns and Chen completed the investigation, satisfied that the truth had come to light. Their attention to detail, such as the pollen from a rare plant on the murder weapon and inconsistencies in Elizabeth's alibi, allowed them to solve this convoluted case. Sarah decided to leave town. It was too hard for her to stay where every place reminded her of lost love and betrayal. She left for another state, hoping to start a new life and gradually heal her wounds. Elizabeth went to trial. At the trial, she looked devastated. The court found her guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced her to life in prison. In the courtroom, she tried to meet Sarah's eyes, but she turned away, unable to forgive. A few months later, Burns and Chen were sitting in their office discussing the completed case. "You know, sometimes the most difficult cases are those involving family ties," Chen remarked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I agree," Burns replied, looking out the window. "It's hard to accept that people can do that to their loved ones. But we did our job. The truth has prevailed, and an innocent man has been set free." "Yeah, but at what cost?" Burns sighed. "Lives have been ruined, and it can't be undone." They fell silent, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Detectives' work was often thankless, but important. They knew they couldn't change the past, but they could ensure justice in the present.